This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for September 10th, 2019, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi, Checkers.
We have a great show for you today. Adam is going to explore whether there's a gay gene.
That's right.
And I'm going to give you a little primer on Canada's election. But first, is the Amazon rainforest the lungs of the earth, Pat?
Right. So we got the following note from Checker Chris on Facebook. Hi there. I'm not sure if you've covered this. The Amazon is often referred to as the lungs of the planet. Is it really possible that the Amazon produces that much oxygen compared to other parts of the planet? So Adam touched on this a little bit last week when he looked into the fires currently burning in the Amazon and concluded that while this year's fires are pretty bad compared to the last few years, they are not unusual and not the worst in the last 15 years. Like last week, I'll stress that there are many good reasons to be concerned about fires in the Amazon rainforest, but also like last week, I want to look at what's true. So, celebrities and political leaders have spoken out. Madonna and Jaden Smith have shared photos on social media. Leonardo DiCaprio said, quote, "The lungs of the earth are in flames." Soccer star Cristiano Ronaldo tweeted, "The Amazon rainforest produces more than 20% of the world's oxygen." French President Emmanuel Macron tweeted, "The Amazon rainforest, the lungs which produce 20% of our planet's oxygen, is on fire." Candidate for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States, Kamala Harris tweeted, "The Amazon creates over 20% of the world's oxygen." But these weren't the only sources. ABC News said it. CNN said it. Business Insider had it as part of the headline on their story about it. But before we jump into that, a bit on the pictures that were shared with many of these social media posts.
Uh-oh.
Mother Jones and others did some fact-checking and found that many of the shared photos were from other fires, including blazes in California and India, or were from previous years.
Wow, I'd heard the years, but I didn't know like other countries entirely is that's a bit alarming.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, the photo Macron tweeted, which was retweeted more than 40,000 times, was taken by Lauren McIntyre, who died in 2003.
No.
Yep. Many people tweeted and retweeted photos from 2014 and 2015. Also making the rounds with the hashtag Amazon Rainforest is a picture from 2013 of a fire at Brazil's Tame Ecological Station. A photo that was retweeted more than 4,000 times with the hashtag Pray for Amazonia is of a fire in Montana's Bitterroot National Forest from 2000. Kendall Jenner retweeted a split image to her more than 28 million followers with a message about how fires in the Amazon have been burning for 3 weeks. The left side of the image dates back to at least 2014 when it was used in articles about forest fires in Sweden. The right side depicts a fire in Siberia.
When people ask, why do we do the show? Right there. That's why.
It's not surprising to me that these photos get retweeted and shared because the people who do so assume they're legitimate. But it's the fact that the person who used it originally, how does that happen? That you put this together and it's just a photo from somewhere else. Did they just Google forest fire? I don't even understand.
Okay, last example. A photo set of 4 images was shared a number of times. One picture depicts a forest fire in California from 2013. The second picture depicts a fire in the Amazon, but dates back to 1989. A third dates back to at least 2018. The fourth is a digital map of South American fires representing the locations and frequencies of fire in the Amazon from 2000 to 2014. All right, so we can't believe many of the pictures that were making the rounds. But what about the Earth's lungs and 20% of the Earth's oxygen part? Forbes reached out to Dr. Dan Nepstad, a leading expert on the Amazon forest, and asked him about the lungs claim. His answer? It's bullshit.
Nice.
There is no science behind that. The Amazon produces a lot of oxygen, but it uses the same amount of oxygen through respiration, so it's a wash.
How dare it?
So this guy is saying, never mind 20%, essentially none of our oxygen comes from the Amazon rainforest. Can that be true?
Wow.
So the animals would use it? Well, you'll explain.
We'll get there. So several scientists have tried to estimate this. Yadvinder Mali, an ecosystem ecologist, wrote a recent blog post about this. He calculates that tropical forests are responsible for around 34% of photosynthesis on land. Based on its size, the Amazon would account for half of that. That would mean the Amazon generates around 16% of the oxygen produced on land. That percentage goes down to 9% when you take into account the oxygen produced by photoplankton in the ocean. Climate scientist Jonathan Foley pegs it at a more conservative estimate of 6% or less. But as Nepstad said, that's not the whole story, because trees also consume oxygen via cellular respiration, where they convert sugars into energy for growth using oxygen. Mali's research team estimates that trees use a little over half of the oxygen they produce. So now we're down to 4.5 or 3%, depending on whose estimates you use. But Mali says that oxygen is used up by the countless microbes which use oxygen to break down dead organic material in the forest. Mali says the net oxygen effect of the Amazon, or really any other biome, is essentially zero. In an article for The Conversation, Scott Denning, a professor of atmospheric science at Colorado State University, writes, "The often-repeated claim that the Amazon rainforest produces 20% of our planet's oxygen is based on a misunderstanding. In fact, nearly all of Earth's breathable oxygen originated in the oceans, and there is enough of it to last for millions of years. There are many reasons to be appalled by this year's Amazon fires, but depleting Earth's oxygen supply is not one of them."
Does that statement mean that if every plant on the surface and under the surface of the Earth died, we could continue to breathe for millions of years and probably die of other things, like not eating? But is that really what that statement is saying?
I was going to get into another part of this, and I'm not going to go too deep on it today because it probably warrants its own segment. But I was going to talk about a scientist and an Atlantic article talking about that scientist, where he paints a scenario where every living thing was burned. What if we combusted every living cell on Earth other than humans? And he wanted to calculate what would happen to the atmosphere if you burned down not just the Amazon, but every forest, every blade of grass, all the flowers, all the bees, all the orchids, all the hummingbirds, all the photoplankton. And he calculated that the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere would drop from 20.9% to 20.4%.
No.
I look forward to this segment. Wow.
Essentially, I have it here, but his quote is, "Generations of humans would live out their lives breathing the air around them, probably struggling to find food, but not worried about where their next breath would come from."
Fascinating.
We'd do better than the dinosaurs did after that asteroid impact.
Well, now, depending on what that asteroid did, whether it created particulate matter or blocked out the sun and cooled things and stopped food, as Pat said, they'd be looking for food.
Yeah, the food. Yeah,
Interesting.
The big thing.
I think essentially his point in painting this sort of apocalyptic scenario is that in order to understand the concentration of oxygen in our atmosphere, you have to look at it on geological timescales.
Yeah, and I guess we don't properly appreciate the vastness, the size of the Earth, the thickness of the atmosphere.
Speak for yourself, Adam. Thank you. Don't want to insult some of our listeners.
I think there's a lot of large-scale things that I just cannot easily wrap my brain around, you know?
I do think the point he was trying to get across is this Gaia symbiotic relationship that we have with plants, where we breathe in oxygen and expel CO2, and they breathe quote unquote CO2 and expel oxygen, is simply incorrect, because you're not accounting for the sort of geological timescale that it requires to understand how the concentration of oxygen got into our atmosphere.
Thanks, Pat. That was fascinating. Adam, is there a gay gene?
A new study has been making headlines, such as, "There's no such thing as a gay gene, a new study argues," from Time magazine, or "Many genes influence same-sex sexuality, not a single gay gene," from the New York Times. So there's a lot going on here. The study, the idea of a gay gene, criticisms of the study. But I'm actually more interested in looking at the specific question of whether or not there is a genetic predisposition to being homosexual based on existing evidence, this study aside. Not to get too ahead of myself, but the answer is almost certainly yes. There is a genetic component, but I'm concerned by many supposedly progressive people denying this simple fact and maybe for wrong reasons. Now, the study is titled Large-Scale GWAS Reveals Insights into the Genetic Architecture of Same-Sex Sexual Behavior. The study itself is what is called a genome-wide association study. Basically, you take a ton of genetic information for a large number of candidates for which some information is known, and you try to correlate some aspect, in this case, being homosexual, to specific genetic markers. So they used UK Biobank and 23andMe databases and found 5 autosomal loci, which we would call genes, which were significantly associated with same-sex behavior. Now, frankly, the study is a bit technical for me, and if I take the media reports word for word, it sounds like it's all good, but I've seen a takedown of the study by Cecile Janssens, and this was also far too technical for me, but it seemed like she was making some very good points in criticizing the study. Now, I'm concerned that some criticism of this study may not be because it's just a bad study, which it may very well be, but because of an increased backlash against this idea that homosexuality is, at least partially, genetic. So for sure, I understand that some people don't like the idea of a blood test or something like that to show that someone is homosexual. Based on what this study is saying and what we've previously learned about genetics and homosexuality, this is not likely to be a problem, but I still understand the concern. While it's likely that there is a genetic predisposition to homosexuality, there is almost certainly no gay gene. Now, Richard Dawkins talks about this a lot in his books. People often talk about a gene for some complex trait or behavior. And yes, you can have a gene which causes a specific ailment, like, for example, sickle cell anemia, but there isn't a single gene for being tall, intelligent, or in this case, homosexual. Complex traits are the result of a combination of large numbers of genes. So tall people will often have tall relatives, but it's not from one gene. There's just a bunch of genes that makes that person tall, and they'll run around in the family. So in the 90s, there was a lot of buzz about the gay gene, but this was a bust, as no single gene ever turned up to be able to predict homosexual behavior. It seems more likely that a combination of genes would be at play. This is what the study is suggesting. Whether those genes that are identified in the study are those genes or not, it's hard to say at this point. But before we look at specific evidence, consider that pretty much all traits and behaviors are partially genetic. Intelligence, height, political beliefs, skin color, hair color, almost any aspect of a person is partially genetic, partially environmental, and that environmental part accounts for development of the fetus in the womb and the environment of life. So it seems that same-sex sexual attraction should be the same, logically. And the evidence indicates this as well. How can we tell? Well, twin studies is an easy way. Basically, if more identical twins, monozygotic twins, share a trait that non-identical, dizygotic twins have, then it's likely at least partially genetically determined. Identical twins have identical DNA, and non-identical twins are basically like siblings as far as the DNA is concerned. In the 1991 study, a gay male's identical twin brother was shown to have a 52% chance of being gay, while a gay male's non-identical twin brother only had a 22% chance. So, correlates stronger with an identical twin, suggests there's a genetic component. Both are higher than the chance of an unrelated person, of course. Though the link isn't 100% for identical twins, that means that that's not the whole story. Genes aren't the entire thing. Another study showed a 66% link for identical twins and 30% link for non-identical twins, and yet another study looking at both gay men and women found only a 20% link for male identical twins and a 24% link for female identical twins. So those numbers vary, but they're all higher than the odds of someone being homosexual in any given population. Now, one issue of interest for twins, identical or not, is that the womb that they share has the same mother's hormonal influences, right? So they're growing in the same womb, and that can have an impact. When we talk about being born this way, it's not strictly genetic. The hormones a fetus is exposed to in pregnancy are the result of the fetus's genes and also the mother's genes and other environmental factors that the mother is exposed to. So with this alone, even if I sequence someone's entire genome and match it to someone who's a homosexual, I can't tell that that person is a homosexual. I take a clone of a homosexual person, I don't know that person's going to be homosexual, then I can't possibly be able to check someone's genome and say this person is homosexual. So these fears of a government being able to use this to sort of round up gay people do nefarious things, they don't match the science, but, these kind of groups aren't always evidence-based. Now, I've done a few segments in the past which also suggest a link between biology and homosexuality. On episode 469, I looked at a deep neural network which looked at photos to estimate someone's sexual orientation, and this was fairly accurate. The idea here is that neonatal hormone exposure from genetics and in the womb environment would affect certain traits in a person's face, which would also affect their sexual orientation. So, the computer was able to see that link. This was not 100%, but it was significant enough to indicate that there's a correlation, and that suggests to us that there is probably a genetic factor in same-sex behavior. Now, way back in episode 161, I talked about gaydar. There were links between some physical traits and homosexuality. These were statistically significant, but often very low, something like it's a 60% link as opposed to chance, which would be 50-50. So not really useful in trying to say, oh, I see someone has this trait, therefore I know they're gay. But it is useful as a scientific measure to once again suggest that there is a biological basis for this behavior. Now, there's almost certainly a genetic predisposition to being homosexual, but that isn't all there is. Obviously, we saw in those twins there wasn't 100% correlation. So what could that be? Now, the older prevailing view was always born this way. Now, even if there is an environmental factor, that doesn't mean someone necessarily made a choice in the matter. It might be worth mentioning that things like kinks and fetishes often do have some basis in one's life experience, but these are very different from something as fundamental to someone as sexual preference. So if someone is raised in a repressive culture where being homosexual is not an option, that may, even unconsciously, be less likely to manifest in a same-sex sexual attraction. Conversely, if someone grows up in an open-minded setting where any sexual attraction is accepted, this may impact how their feelings develop, and that may lead to a higher likelihood of homosexuality. So there may also be some cases where childhood abuse will lead a person to reject opposite sex attraction. This is likely rare and not a factor for most homosexual people. It's hard to tease this sort of nuance apart, and people have this idea of an authentic self, which is a bit essentialist and ignores that people change quite a bit throughout their lifetime. So that's a factor too. People's sexual preferences can change throughout their life, and it doesn't mean at one point in their life it wasn't completely legitimate, or that one is more right and another is more wrong.
Or you could even imagine their culture changes, and then, well, then it might be the expressed sexual preference, not the actual sexual preference.
Sure.
But there might be a nuance that would sort of feed into each other in that domain.
Yeah, so you do have people who say, I've always felt this way, but I wasn't able to express it. But you also have people whose preferences do change throughout their lives, and it's completely legitimate. People who deny that homosexuality has a genetic component, or say things like people choose to be gay, have historically been homophobic people. They're often religious people who see homosexuality as a sin, possibly some perversion by Satan, or just some perversion of the ideal image of what a person is. This leads to terrible things like conversion therapy, and we've talked about that on the show a couple of times. It's horrible. This is non-scientific. It should not be going on. Conversion therapy isn't just wrong because it doesn't respect someone's stated orientation, but also because it goes against the biological fact that homosexuality is an unchangeable aspect of a person's identity.
Right, I just wanted to highlight that when you said the fundamental thing is that it thinks it can change, I was like, well, the fundamental thing is that they think it's wrong in the first place.
Yes.
And then also they think it can change.
Right, so because they think it's wrong, they rationalize to themselves that it has to be changeable. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's just hard to explain it. And there's other baggage that comes with that worldview that may lead to that belief. So this is kind of why I'm troubled by people with progressive views who label homosexuality as a choice. Is this view all that common? I'm not sure. And we kind of talked about this after the show last week when I mentioned I would do this. But I do see some people say this, which is a bit of a concern for me. So where does this come from? Now, I can't be sure where people get their ideas, but I think it's important to try to figure that out as part of our journey in discovering the truth. I do know of one potential reason for which this line of thought might be embraced by some people. And that is social constructivism. Now, I've talked about this on the show before. It's the belief that all aspects of one's personality, usually related to gender or sexuality, are socially constructed, also known as the blank slate. So we're all coming out as a blank slate, and everything that molds us is by society and by environment. Now, I absolutely believe that aspects of gender and sexuality are socially constructed. I don't think that's really questionable. The extreme view that they are totally socially constructed is sort of pseudoscience. So the idea that it's 100% environment. Most people seem to think it's a mix, and maybe they're not sure of where that line is drawn. I consider this view to be almost conspiracy theory-like. Believers do mental gymnastics to suggest that humans are socially programmed with views from infancy before even our first words, because that's the only way that some behaviors that you'll observe in people can make sense. So if a little girl plays with a doll or a boy plays with a truck, the social constructivist blames the gender roles established by society, blames the parents for maybe even subconsciously putting it on the children, when a lot of gender-specific behavior can be genetic. Not to say girls can't play with trucks and boys can't play with dolls, but if you tease it out, and we talked about this on the show very long ago, there's some differences in that interest and other behaviors. So this gets into the distinction between sex and gender. I've been criticized for confusing these two in the past. It gets a little tricky. Sex is considered to be the biology, gender, more the social aspect. But if you come at it from a biological determinist point of view, you can't really decouple the two. But if you come at it purely from a social constructivism point of view, then the two don't really have a relation. So it can be a little tricky. Now, social constructivists discard entire fields which are inconvenient to their worldview, such as evolutionary psychology, many aspects of psychology, and biology. Now, no doubt a lot of what is considered to be gender is socially constructed. I don't think there's a genetic basis for boys wearing blue and girls wearing pink. But aspects which exist through all cultures, throughout all of time, throughout the entire planet, and even in non-human species are likely not social constructions. Now, these would be things like women being more nurturing, men being more violent, and drastically different approaches men and women have to dating and mating. So these are on average, of course, and these traits vary wildly per individual. So you could have a very nurturing man, a very violent woman, but on average, there's some predispositions. So this is basically a blank slate approach to people, in this case, gender. And if I don't explain it too eloquently, just read Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate. It's a great book. So social constructivism is in vogue. These beliefs are fairly common. It's a core belief of many mainstream feminists because the easiest way to argue that men and women should be treated equally is to assume that they are identical in all ways. And I understand that people come at this with a good intention. I understand why the idea is seductive, and I used to buy into this idea. But I don't think the evidence is there. Why am I ranting about this again? Well, because if gender is a social construct, then why not sexuality? So if you're going to embrace the fact that gender is socially constructed, you're not consistent in your worldview if you say that sexuality is something that's genetic or something that's biological in nature. And it's fine because a lot of people can hold opposing views which are at odds with each other because we're basically irrational beings. But still, I think maybe there's some of this that might be going on. So yes, people do believe that sexuality is socially constructed, and this is queer theory. It explains that all sexuality is a social construct, that there is no genetic basis for gender, and that any sexual preference is determined by one's social environment. This is not good science. It goes against the scientific evidence, which suggests at least a partial genetic basis for sexual preference, as I've discussed throughout the segment. So it's not about what's right, it's about what's true. I can construe a situation where homosexuality was a choice and should be respected, and we can make arguments for why it should be. So I understand that that's not valid, and people say, well, it's not an issue, but we can still talk about that. There's a separate issue of whether or not someone is born that way, and the science is pretty clear. They are, or they at least are born predisposed to it. So there is no gay gene. There never really was. But homosexuality does have a genetic basis, and there is a predisposition to being homosexual that is in a person's genes. As social constructivism gets more and more popular amongst educated progressive people, I worry that the idea that sexual preference is socially constructed will become more prominent. I really hope I'm wrong about this and that I'm worrying for nothing. If you're tempted by such ideas, just try to remember how long people have been fighting against religious zealots who are arguing the same thing and what those implications had.
Thank you, Adam. You raised a lot of interesting points. For me, I find it useful to reflect upon why people might believe what they believe. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, as you said, it's driven by an outcome that they do or do not want. So say if someone wants homosexuality to be accepted, then they say, well, what suits my beliefs better about that being the case? The fact that it is a choice or the fact that it isn't a choice?
Yeah.
Which is independent of whether it's true that it's a choice or not, or maybe it's both. So I find that an interesting aspect of this whole thing. It's like, well, wouldn't it be nice if we just didn't care? It'd be nice in the future when we'd be like, well, people cared about this?
Sure.
What does that matter? And then they'd be like, well, it turns out there is a genetic disposition, or there isn't. Neither one actually matters.
You know, if I can just add a thought to that, even if you don't care and you think people shouldn't care, the fact that other people do care is an issue.
I know.
For example, Doug Ford is the Premier of Ontario. One of the things he ran on was abolishing the sex ed curriculum. People voted against that sex ed curriculum because they're concerned that it would make their kids trans or it would make their kids gay. Well, if people didn't think that that's how it worked, they maybe wouldn't have voted that way. So it's important to sort of share that, the truth of what it is, even if you think it shouldn't matter.
Right. And even highlighting the point that there may be different subpopulations of different demographics which aren't inconsistent as a whole. People who are very lefty, progressive, and social constructivists may inadvertently support right-wing people at the opposite end for beliefs that they don't want them to have. Now we turn to something slightly less controversial, Canada's election. It's a primer. Given it will be Canada's election season by the time you hear this, I thought I'd talk to our listeners, both foreign and domestic, a little bit about our election season. The 2019 Canada federal election will be our 43rd general election, and this will take place on October 21st, 2019, a date that was determined by the fixed date procedures in our Canada Elections Act. Unless we have an election earlier, due to the Governor-General of Canada from issuing the writs of election at an earlier date. What? Well, here's a little context. In Canada, an election has to be held at least every 5 years, but could be shorter. Who decides? The party in power. Does this mean that the parties that call elections when it suited them best? Yes. Yes, that's exactly what they did.
Of course it did.
So to address this, the 39th Canadian Parliament passed Bill C-16, an act to amend the Canada Elections Act, which passed on May 3rd, 2007. It required that each general election take place on the third Monday in October in the fourth calendar year following the previous election, starting with October 19th, 2009, meaning every 4 years in October. This didn't even last the next election because the next one was actually in 2008. So this happened in 2007. Make it 2008. Didn't even make it. As then Prime Minister Harper called an early election. Aspirational goals indeed. In fact, the next election was in May 2011 after a vote of non-confidence, but it lasted, the election period, until October 2015 when our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, was elected. If our election is actually this October, as intended, I think it's the first time the period will actually be October to October, as intended, 12 years ago.
Oh, interesting.
There's a phrase that's uttered in Canada, especially around Ottawa, saying dropping the writ. But what is a writ of election, and what do people mean when they say the writ has been dropped? What do they mean? This means the election season has begun, or something. Happily, the Ottawa Citizen had a nice election explainer piece on the writ. You can find it in the notes at trcpodcast.com.
Great website.
The opening line, quote, "Let's get this cleared up right now. The Prime Minister doesn't drop the writ. The Prime Minister has no such function and no writs either, and dropping is just the wrong word." The Prime Minister visits our Governor-General with a letter recommending the dissolution of Parliament, ending our legislative branch. Officially, this is an instrument of advice. The Governor-General typically signs it and ends all House and Senate business, but not normal government operations. Yes, we're a functioning democracy, so our government still functions, just our House and our Senate stop functioning. The Governor-General then signs some more documents, one of which requests the issuance of writs of general election from the Chief Electoral Officer. As for the origins of the phrase, drop the writ, the Citizen piece says it goes back to 13th century England.
Wow.
They cite Howard Richler, who says the original term is draw up the writ, and this morphed into drop the writ over time. It just sounds a bit better.
It sounds more like cool.
Yeah, drop it like it's hot. Drop it hot. These formal written orders go across the country to instruct that an election be held in a particular riding, which is a region for us, and other information. Writs cannot be issued or dated later than the 36th day before Election Day, making the minimum length of a federal election campaign 36 days. Meaning September 15th would be the last day that could start the election process.
Okay.
I think it'd be better if they called it putting on the writ.
That's cute.
Nice.
It is hard to follow that line, but I learned today, because I wrote this segment yesterday, that the writ will likely be dropped tomorrow, which is Wednesday, the 11th, which means
I read that too.
The Canada election season will definitely have begun by the time you hear this, dearest listeners.
Yeah.
So that's the writ part. And I thought I'd just give you a few other aspects about the Canadian election. And a lot of it's just compared to the Americans, because that is our big neighbor to the south, when we obviously have a bit more in common with the British method. Our election period is much shorter. Yes. As anyone knows in the States, your election period almost never stops, quite frankly. But people are currently going through primaries now. We don't really have that. Yes, there are conventions that the different parties hold at different times, but our election period is quite short. Our election period also has a lot less money involved, and that's not just because it's in Canadian dollars. Now, our executive branch is part of our legislative branch, unlike the Americans. For everyone listening, quick civics lesson. In the Americans, you have a president, you have the Congress, and you have the Senate. All right, there are three separate bodies, which is why you can have a president of one party and a Congress of a different party. All right. The Senate is supposed to be somewhat equally representative across the country, 2 from each state, while the Congress is proportional to the population. Somewhat similarly, Canada has a legislative body, which is proportional to the population. There's places that have more people, that have more representatives, while our Senate is also 1 or 2 from a particular region. But for us, our leader, our prime minister, is actually part of our legislative branch. So this is why, in a technical sense, a Canadian prime minister has more power than an American president, even if both the House and the Senate in the States are the same party as the president. As you saw, if you pay attention to any American politics, when Republicans controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency, they still couldn't get things passed. This does not happen in Canada. Because if you have a majority, you just get to pass things. Oh, yeah. Your leader is part of the party with the most amount of seats, and you all agree with each other because that's how it is. So, of course, though, in practical sense, the U.S. president has more power than almost any human on Earth. Assuming he's human at the moment.
Of course, Darren, it still has to go through the Tim Hortons legislative branch.
That's true. I should have said that.
Yeah.
Now, we don't actually vote for a prime minister like Americans vote for a president. Sure. When voting for a president, there are specific names to choose from, and you select one, like Ivanka or Chelsea. While we vote for a representative in a particular riding, which, as I said, is a geographical region, who becomes a minister of parliament. The prime minister, as the name implies, is the main minister. If your party has the greatest number of seats in parliament, which is the same as saying ministers in parliament, then your party selects a leader, and that person is the prime minister. This does not happen after the fact, though, because parties decide on their leaders who would become prime minister if they happen to get all the seats ahead of time. So in practice, people often vote for a particular party with a particular leader in mind, not thinking that much at all about who leads their local riding. So yes, they are technically voting for a local representative, but in practice, they may not even know that person's name. They just know the color of the box that they want to tick because they want to vote for the leader.
Well, and this can lead to some complications like, you could have a minority government, and then the 2 other parties could make a coalition and get another prime minister. And people say, well, that's not the person I voted for. But you say, that's not how elections work. Correct. In Canada. You voted for a representative.
That is exactly true, although that is exceptionally rare. Yeah. I'm not even sure if that's happened.
They threaten it all the time. Oh, people always complain about it.
Of course they do. Of course they do, because people sometimes who are ideologically similar-minded hate each other even more than they're ideologically opposed.
Yes.
Anyway, I just thought I'd give a quick primer on the Canada election, and that's mainly what we're about. Thanks for joining us once again. Pat told us that the Amazon rainforest are not the lungs of the earth. You have to turn to the oceans for that. And Adam explored that there is nothing like a gay gene. It would be one of these polygenic things like almost everything else is. And I talked to you a little bit about Canada's election, which will just be great to hear about for the next 6 to 8 weeks. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
What is a writ of election, and what do people mean when they say the writ has been dropped? Now, for those of you, this dropped above us, which is mildly ironic. Let me try that again. And we have a completely different method. There's also a lot less money involved. Oh, what's someone bowling upstairs now? Thanks for joining us once again. Pat explored where the spiteful pipes just began.